So, Beth, tell me how homeschooling in high school has changed since your kids were in high school, certainly since my kids were in high school. And what challenges homeschool parents face now?
Yeah, definitely lots of changes. My kids graduated in 2011, 2013, and 2015. So it's only been about 16 years since the last one graduated, or 11 years since the last one graduated. But I do see huge changes. There's cultural changes just in the view towards homeschooling for sure. My kids always were sort of the odd ones out. When we went out in public, um, they kind of stood out a little bit. There were questions, why were they out during the day? It's definitely much more accepted now. I think there's also a larger group of students homeschooling. So not that my kids weren't, it wasn't good to have friends from public and private school, but it's nice to have some friends who understand what you're doing. And I think kids now have more opportunities for those friendships amongst other homeschoolers. But also just the amount of opportunities that are out there because people understand that homeschooling is such a big thing now, both curriculum options, ways to present material, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more, but lots of options there. But also, I think the opportunities like the internships, the entrepreneurship, the colleges, all of that has expanded even more as society as a whole has accepted homeschooling more and become more accustomed to it and have had a chance to see the positive impacts of it.
You know, one thing that I have loved, that I really did love, and I want to read this quote, and I think I will read it. This is from Rachel Kovac's book, Their Future is Shining Bright. I did a podcast with her. If you want to look in the show notes, you can find out where that is. But she said this. She talks about the powerful synthesis of core academics and interest-led learning in homeschooling. I love that concept. And I want to talk about that too in conjunction with this C.S. Lewis quote she introduced me to. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. And so I think, we are really watering the ground of where our kids are interested and where they will bloom really the most beautifully or flourish in ways that they may not have been able to do had they been in an institutional setting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it has to be an either or. I think the academics are an important piece to it. That is what gives us some building blocks, some core knowledge that they can build from. But then when you combine the academics with the interest-led learning, it's just a beautiful marriage of learning where it's really the best of both worlds. So I really see it as something that it's not an either or, but a both and.
One of the things I've talked about before on the podcast, and to me, this is not an example of, well, I'll just let you decide what is an example of desperation, maybe that worked out okay. We were starting to homeschool when we homeschooled in Ty was in the 9th grade, John was in the 7th grade, and Lizzie was in the 1st grade. So I was having to teach her how to read, introduce John to what is now middle school, then junior high school, and Ty to high school. And it was the thought of all those change points. I will tell you, it was really driving me to distraction. And so the first week of all of this nonsense, Lizzie somehow taught herself to read. I've never understood that, but she did. But I looked at John one day. This first wasn't one day. It was the first week of homeschooling in high school, and he was in the 7th grade. I said, "Congratulations, John! You've been promoted to the 9th grade." And I knew he was capable academically. It wasn't like he was having to go to a high school where he'd be 2 years younger than everybody. But so I mainly all of the coursework I did with Ty, like Mr. Staudenbauer's classes in science, which came on the scene that year, which was a blessing. John was able to take those classes with Ty, did the same math. We had the same Spanish tutor. We did the same reading assignments. So really, by the time he was a junior in high school, he had finished most of his coursework. And so for us, that was amazing. He spent a year touring the country with Teen Pack, teaching classes in different state capitals to teenagers his age. He worked in the Senate, the South Carolina Senate, and was able to spend some time in the U.S. Senate program and Page program up in D.C. He traveled a lot with a friend of his, their family, who traveled quite a bit. I look at that and I think there is no way that could have happened in an institutional setting. And what was really born out of a lot of tears and prayer on my part, feeling so inadequate to do middle school and high school at the same time, really ended up being one of the tools God used to open a lot of doors for John. And I think, one thing I've heard you talk about so much, Beth, is how God meets us in our homeschooling. And he not only shores up his our weaknesses, he just creates opportunities for our kids when we don't have the resources to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to approach it somewhat with open hands. I mean, I'm a planner, I'm a list maker. I love a good plan, I love a good spreadsheet. But I think I was challenged, maybe even more so because of that, to be willing to ask God for direction. What does He want for our kids? And then be willing to follow that. And that was a prayer I prayed a lot is, Lord, what do you want me to do to prepare my kids for whatever you have planned for them down the road? And it was amazing how, I mean, I shouldn't think it's amazing. It is amazing, but I shouldn't be surprised that he faithfully and repeatedly answered that prayer by pretty much dropping things in our lap or in our path or guiding us to different things that were just huge blessings to us that, again, like you said, when we would not have had the opportunity to do otherwise. And what I find interesting is some of the things that my kids did in high school that they were passionate about, that they pursued, that they used that extra time for, they're not even necessarily using them as adults, but they're benefiting from them as adults. Like I can see how the years of speech and debate that my boys participated in, how it took two somewhat introverted and shy guys and gave them a voice and an ability to speak and to share their thoughts and beliefs. And that's a lifelong skill, whether they're not actively involved in a debate league, they're not politicians, they're not lawyers, but they're still benefiting from that. And I love to see how God uses those things, even when we don't know how He'll use them.
That's right. And I think that's really important too. I was talking to a good friend of ours, Janie Gibson, and on the podcast, she said the same thing that, one day I think one of her children may just have quit playing sports. When John was on a championship team in soccer. I mean, they had won the state championship several years. They'd gone to the regional several years. And he just said one day, okay, I think this is a good time to stop. Well, first of all, our reaction was, "You can't quit soccer now. This is where our whole friend base is. You and Ty playing soccer. What do you mean you're quitting?" But of course, that was his decision, and then he went on to do a lot of other interesting things. But there are things about sports that prepare you for life. Working with a team, meeting the challenge, just all of those things. And I think what you're saying is right. These things are all preparatory, whether they do them as adults or not, because those skills are still usable skills. Being able to speak and communicate well, our kids need, whether they're in STEM, especially maybe if they're in STEM vocations. I was talking to a friend of ours who has a son who's very verbal and actually is a STEM guy. And she said it's so unusual because most of his STEM friends don't really communicate as verbally as he does. And so she said it's a real benefit to him. And, it's those things that our kids do that they invest in. I think they bear fruit in many ways the rest of their lives, like you're saying.
God will use all of those things. I think the key is that for us as parents to be actively seeking His direction and then following where He's leading us. And even when that doesn't always make sense.